I carried that secret for so long that it stopped seeming like something external became part of me, like a scar that no longer bleeds, but it never disappears. At first, it was just information, something I accidentally saw, something I shouldn't have heard, but what I heard, and in that moment, not fully understanding the weight I chose to keep, because it seemed like the safest decision, more logic, more correct. I was loyal. I have always been trained to obey, to protect, not to question more than necessary, and that's exactly what I did. I didn't question, I didn't say, I didn't share. I buried it deep, where no one could reach, not even me. But secrets don't disappear. They grow silently, feeding on time from fear. What we avoid facing the first signs were small, almost imperceptible, subtle changes in the behavior of people around me. Conversations that stopped when I approached, looks that lasted a little longer than they should have. Nothing direct, nothing that could be pinpointed with certainty, but enough to bother, enough to plant doubt, and doubt, when it grows, it becomes something difficult to ignore. I started paying more attention, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Something inside me said that what I carried, it wasn't as hidden as I believed, and this feeling didn't come from nowhere. It came from small details, things out of place, orders that didn't make sense, movements that did not follow the standard. It was like the world around me had changed, but only I realized, or maybe only I was affected. The nights got longer, the light asleep. Any sound seemed like a warning, any silence felt like preparation, and little by little certainty began to take shape. They knew not everything, but enough to watch me, to measure me, to decide what to do with me. And that's when I understood the real problem. It was no longer about keeping the secret, it was about surviving with him. Because carrying that thing made me a risk, and risks are eliminated. I tried to ignore, I tried to carry on as always, fulfilling orders, maintaining routine, pretending that nothing had changed, but it only worked for a short time, because the body reacts. Even when the mind tries to deny, my posture changed, my way of speaking has changed, even the way I look at people has changed. And it was noticed, I saw it in the faces, in the way they avoided closeness, in the way some started to get too close. There was always someone around, there was always a reason, but it was never a coincidence. I started counting steps, memorizing routes, avoiding patterns, without even realizing. I was doing it like an animal that senses danger before it sees it. And then the moment came that confirmed everything. A conversation not meant for me, but what I heard like years ago, this time with full awareness of what it meant. They spoke quietly, but not enough. And what was said left no room for doubt. My name was there, not as a soldier, not as an ally, but as a problem, like something to be resolved. I stood still, without reacting, without making noise, but inside everything changed, because at that moment, the secret I protected for years, it stopped being just a burden, and it became a sentence. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't wait any longer, because waiting meant giving time, and time it was exactly what they needed. I retreated slowly without being noticed, but each step carried a decision, the most important thing I've ever taken, because now I was no longer protecting the secret, I was trying to survive it, and for the first time I considered something I avoided for years, and if keeping that was a mistake. What really kept me alive until now? It wasn't silence, but the fact that no one has yet decided to act. I stopped at a safe point, or as close to it as there was. I took a deep breath, and I tried to organize everything, but there was no organization possible. Just a simple truth, Clara, impossible to ignore. I was alone against something that was already in motion, long before I realized, and now it had begun to close in around me. No rush, flawless, exactly how it should be done. I put my hand on my chest, not for pain, but by instinct, as if I could hold it inside me, as if I could stop it from leaving, but it was too late for that, because the secret, it was no longer just with me. It was all around me, in the looks, in decisions and intentions, and mainly in the silence. I opened my eyes, feeling something different. Don't be afraid, not exactly, but clarity. The same one that comes when there is no more choice, because at that point there were only two paths. Keep running away, or finally understand. What exactly did I carry for so long, and why that should never have been kept a secret? And it was at that moment that I realized there was no point in pretending anymore. Go normality, continuing to follow orders as if nothing had changed, was just a slow way to disappear. Because now I knew they had already started to act. And when that happens, everything around changes. Without warning, I went back inside like nothing was wrong, keeping the pace, the posture, the neutral look, but inside every detail was analyzed. Every face was reevaluated, who avoided contact, who watched too much, who seemed to act exactly the same as always, because sometimes the most dangerous, it's who doesn't change. I walked the halls, feeling the invisible weight accompanying me, as if every step was recorded, as if every move is being measured, and maybe it was. At that point, I no longer ruled out anything. I arrived at my post. Same as always, the same space. The same walls, but completely different, because now I saw what I previously ignored: small marks on the wood, discrete risks. Signs that could mean counting control or just coincidence. But coincidences no longer existed for me. I approached the table. I ran my hand slowly across the surface, feeling the texture, looking for any irregularities, anything that wasn't there before, and I found almost imperceptible, one line thin, recent. It wasn't where. It was intentional. Someone was there after me and didn't bother to hide it completely, or maybe I wanted me to see. This possibility made me stop for a second, because everything changed if that was a warning. So it wasn't just surveillance, it was pressure. I kept control. I didn't react. I didn't look around abruptly. I just continued as if I hadn't noticed, but my mind was already too far ahead, connecting dots, rearranging everything. If they were coming into my space without leaving clear signs, so they had full access, and that meant one thing: I no longer had any safe place. From there, each step needed to be calculated more precisely, not just to avoid being followed, but to avoid confirming that I knew. Why no, that's what put me at risk. I stayed there for some time, simulating routine moving. Objects, organizing papers, creating a visible pattern, something that could be observed and considered normal. Meanwhile, I thought, if that's objective, I needed something concrete, something beyond sensation. In addition to behavior, I needed to understand what exactly they knew and how far were they willing to go. It was then that I decided to test, not directly, but in a subtle way. I left something out of place. A small detail, but noticeable to anyone paying attention, and I left no rush without looking back, but completely focused on what came next. The test was not immediate. It was about time, about reaction. I spent the rest of the day watching without seeming like I was watching conversations, movements, minimal changes, and nothing happened. Nothing visible, nothing direct, which made everything even more tense. Because it meant one of two things: or didn't they realize? Or they realized and decided not to react. This second option was much worse. When I returned to my space, the first thing I did was look straight to the point where I left the object, and he was there exactly as I left it, but not the same. The position had changed millimeters. Almost impossible to notice. But I noticed, and in that moment, everything was confirmed. They were there, entering, observing, interacting, without ever revealing yourself completely. It was a game silent, and I had been placed inside it, no choice. I sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the situation take hold, because now there was no more doubt. They knew maybe not everything, but enough to not let me out of control, and that meant they were waiting for the right moment, waiting for failure, waiting for me to make a mistake. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, I thought about doing the opposite of what I did for years. Instead of hiding, instead of protecting, I considered exposing, but not directly, not yet. Why expose without preparation? It would just speed up the inevitable. I needed to understand more and more from the system, more of the people involved, more of the roots of the failures, because every system has flaws, even the best built, and I needed to find theirs. Before they found mine, I got up with a decision already made. Not completely clear, but solid enough. I wasn't just going to react anymore. I was going to start acting in silence on the same level in the same game, because if they were watching me, then I would also start watching back. And this time, not like someone trying to survive, but as someone willing to find out how far did that secret really go, and who exactly I was willing to kill for it. And that's exactly what I started to do. Watch back, but not in the usual way, not looking directly, not following people. This would be perceived and used against me. I needed to change the way I saw everything. I started paying attention to what didn't attract attention, in the intervals between actions and patterns repeated for no apparent reason, in the details that no one tries to hide, because you believe no one is watching. And it was there that the first pieces began to fall into place. The same faces appeared at different points of the day, always with plausible justifications. All was busy, all was as expected, but never quite in the right place. It was subtle but constant, as if they were distributed, covering areas, without looking like they were doing it. I didn't face any of them directly. I gave no sign of recognition, but I started to mentally map who appeared, where, at what time, who did you talk to, and mainly who was never questioned, because in any structure there are always those who pass by without being noticed. Not because they are invisible, but because they are considered part of the environment. These are the most dangerous. Continued my routine, fulfilling duties, responding when necessary, but always with part of the attention shifted, always analyzing. And then I realized something even more important. It wasn't just about who was watching me. It was about who was being kept away from me. Some people who used to cross my path frequently, they just stopped showing up. No, explanation, no visible replacement, as if they were removed from my reach. This was no coincidence, it was information control, contact control. They were limiting what I could see or who could talk to me, and it gave me a new direction. If they were restricting, it was because there was risk, and risk only exists when something can escape. I needed to find the point where this control wasn't perfect, and every control fails somewhere always. I started moving around less crowded areas, not abruptly, but gradually changing small routes, creating new paths, testing reactions. And again, nothing direct happened, but the environment responded. Small adjustments, people who appeared where they weren't before, quicker glances, more attentive, as if they were recalculating, adapting. This confirmed something else. They weren't just following a fixed plan, they were reacting. And that meant I still had margin small, but enough. It was then that I decided to go further. Don't just observe, but provoke in a controlled way. I needed to force a response, something clearer, something that could not be confused with coincidence. Choose a specific point, an area where movement was less, but still relevant, and I stayed there longer than usual, for no apparent reason, no defined task gift, only observing, feeling, and waiting. The effect was not immediate, but it came first. A man passed, looked too quickly, then another who pretended not to notice, but he slowed down, and then the most important, a third that wasn't there before, that was not part of that pattern, and that remained longer than anyone else. Stopped, as if evaluating. I didn't look directly, but I understood everything. In the corner of your vision, by the rhythm of breathing, for the silence around, he was there for me, and at that moment I had the clearest confirmation. Yet I wasn't just being watched, I was being actively monitored in real time. I stayed a few more seconds, and then I left, as if nothing had happened, but inside, everything was changing again, because now I knew. The level, the intensity, and the reach. I walked back through the halls, keeping control, but speeding up the thought if they were reacting like this. 2 small changes, so any major action, it would be immediate, direct, and probably final. This meant I needed to be even more precise, quieter, more invisible than before. I could no longer test openly. Needed to act in layers, create distractions, false moves, and hide the true goal within it. I stopped at an isolated point. I leaned against the wall and I closed my eyes for a second, not to rest, but to organize, because now the game had changed again, and I needed to follow. I was no longer just someone with a secret. I was someone within a system that was already on alert. And that made everything more dangerous, but also more revealing, because alert systems make mistakes, and mistakes leave marks, and brands can be followed. I opened my eyes, feeling the decision form more clearly. I needed to find the center, not the edges, not the observers, but who was above them, who gave the orders, who knew exactly what that secret meant. Because while I was only dealing with the surface, I would keep reacting, and reacted would never be enough to survive. I moved away from the wall, returning to walking now with a more defined objective. Most dangerous but necessary river, because the more I understood, it became clearer. That what I carried, it wasn't just something forbidden, it was something that should never be discovered. In the simple fact that I'm still alive, it meant there was a reason I still didn't fully understand, but that someone somewhere, I was already trying to decide if I should keep breathing or disappear like everyone else. And it was this realization that completely changed the way I started to move. It was no longer about avoiding attention. It was about understanding why I hadn't been eliminated yet. Because in a system like that, mistakes are not tolerated for long. And I had already gone too far to be ignored, which meant my existence still served some purpose. And that was more dangerous than any direct pursuit, because it turned me into something useful, and useful things are not. Released or controlled, I kept walking, but now with a new focus. No more on the watchers, but in this structured access at points where decisions were made, because whoever observes executes, but who decides. I started to notice areas that required different levels of permission. Doors that were never open, corridors that seemed ordinary, but they were little used. People passing by, always with a more rigid posture, more restrained, as if they carried something other than routine. And it was there that I found the first relevant pattern. These people never walked alone for long. There was always an exchange, a meeting point, a specific moment where one presence replaced another. No words, no obvious signs, but perfectly synchronized. That was no coincidence. It was protocol, and protocols exist to protect something or someone. I slowed down, keeping distance, observing without seeming interested. I identified one of these points, a seemingly ordinary intersection, but with controlled flow, where exchanges happened cleanly, no interruptions, no deviations. I passed by there once, non-stop, then another, slightly changing the rhythm, and then I realized a detail that almost went unnoticed. A door discreet, no clear marking. that was never used directly, but I was always close to these exchanges. Nobody got in front of me, but someone always left later, as if access was calculated not to be seen. That made me slow down even more, to the point of almost stopping, but without attracting attention. I needed to confirm, without exposing myself. Without breaking the pattern, I kept passing that spot over the next few days. Always adjusting something. Time, direction, presence, and repetition revealed. More schedules were consistent. People changed, but the behavior does not, and the door had remained. The only fixed element silent, ignored. But central, I knew that was one of the hits. Maybe not the main one, but important enough to be protected. That way, and that put me in front of a decision. Going in there without preparation would be suicide, but ignored it would be to remain stuck on the surface level. I needed a way to get closer, without activating any immediate response, and that required something I had been avoiding until then. Direct interference. I started to study time more accurately. Seconds, intervals, distances, every movement around that area, until you find a small flaw. Minimum space between one exchange and another, short but real. Enough for someone to cross without crossing paths with another if it were fast, and I need. But still risky, because I didn't know what was on the other side. And worse, I didn't know who would be watching. Beyond that point, I walked away for a moment, processing, reevaluating, because that one step would change everything. Until then, I was testing, observing. Now I would be invading, and there would be no going back. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of choice, but also clarity, because at that point, standing still was just postponing the inevitable. They were already close. They were already paying attention, and waiting would only give them more time to close all the exits I needed to move. Before that, I got back on track with the time, already calculated. The aligned body, the focused mind. Without hesitation. Why hesitate at that moment? It would be the most basic error and the most fatal. I approached the point, watching the exchange happen exactly as expected. A presence, leaving another still distant. The space was there, small, but enough. I didn't look around, I didn't slow down. I just adjusted the step, and I followed direct, no pause. Without a doubt, my hand reached the door. The touch was quick, controlled, and when she gave in, I felt immediately the different air, colder, denser, as if that space wasn't part of the rest. I entered, and the door closed behind me. No sound, no resistance. And in that moment, before I even fully saw what was there, I understood I had just crossed a line that should never exist for someone like me. And regardless of what I found next, one thing was already certain: I was no longer part of the outside. I was now inside, from the place where the secret was no longer just a risk, and it became a sentence. And it was the moment the door closed behind me that I felt. The silence inside was not the absence of sound, it was control, as if everything in that space was designed not to escape. No noise, no information, no presence. I remained motionless for a few seconds, letting my eyes adjust, not just lighting but the environment, because places like this don't show everything right away. They reveal little by little. As if they tested who entered. The light was low, but enough cold, no variation, no apparent origin. The walls were clean, no marks, no signs of use. The kind of environment that feels new all the time, but it's actually kept that way to hide what really happens there. I took the first step, slow, controlled, feeling the solid ground. Without any sound, no echo, no answer. This nullified any reference. It made it impossible to know the actual size of the space, or what existed beyond the field of vision. And that was no coincidence. It was strategy. Disorient, control, perception, reduce reaction. I advanced a few more steps, paying close attention to every detail. And then I started to realize subtle lines on the walls, almost invisible, like divisions, hidden panels, doors that didn't look like doors. That wasn't just a hallway, it was a modular structure, able to change, or at least hide access. I didn't touch anything, not yet, because any interaction could trigger something. And at that point, I still didn't know what kind of system I was dealing with. But one thing quickly became clear. It wasn't just a passing space, it was a nucleus. An internal point where something was kept or processed. I kept moving forward, following the only visible path. No apparent forks, but with a constant feeling that there was more there, much more. And then the environment changed. Almost imperceptibly, the temperature dropped slightly. The air became even heavier, and a sound began to emerge, very low, almost non-existent, but continuous one. Pulse regular as an active system. I headed in the direction of that sound, each step more conscious than the last, because now I knew I was approaching something central. And that's when the hallway opened without warning. No clear transition, it just stopped being narrow and revealed a room. Wide, organized, neat in the center. A structure, not exactly a machine, but not something common either. It was complex, with smooth surfaces and parts that seemed to respond to the environment as if I were alive. But what really grabbed me it wasn't that it was what was around records. Files arranged in a methodical way, each identified, catalogued, controlled. That was an information system. But not just any kind, it was specific, targeted, and I already had an idea of what it was about. Even before confirming, I approached slowly, the look passing through the records without touching, just reading, absorbing, and then I found my name there among many others. Organized, classified, updated. This was no ordinary surveillance. It was complete monitoring history, movements, interactions, everything registered, everything stored. I felt the impact, not in the body, but in the mind. Because that confirmed something much bigger. I wasn't a bug in the system, I was part of it long before I realized the secret I protected. For years it was never really hidden, he was always known. Catalogued, accompanied, and that changed everything, because it meant I wasn't being hunted for discovering something, I was being held. Observed, guided perhaps to get to exactly where I was now. I remained silent, processing, connecting every detail, every coincidence, every event from the past. Nothing had been random, nothing. And that brought an inevitable question. If everything was allowed so far, so what exactly did they expect me to do now? I looked away from the records, returning to the central structure, feeling like the answer was there, somehow connected, waiting. And at that moment, a deeper realization formed. I hadn't invaded that place. I had been led to him and accepted. It was understanding that the next step, maybe it was no longer my choice either. And it was exactly this feeling that began to become impossible to ignore. The idea that my every step up until that point had not been resistance, but part of a path already traced. I remained looking at that structure in the center of the room, trying to understand if that was just a storage point or something more active, smarter, more involved than I'd like to admit. The sound was sound that I had heard before, was coming from there. A constant pulse, and flawless, like a system that never turns off, never pauses, never makes mistakes. Like a closer, carefully observing the surfaces, trying to identify any interface, any point of contact, but there was nothing obvious. No screen, no buttons, nothing that indicated direct use, which only reinforced the possibility that didn't need common interaction, or worse. He recognized who was in front of him. I stopped a few steps away, feeling the air even thicker, as if the space around that structure was different from the rest of the room, most loaded, more present. And then it happened without warning. No additional sound, a subtle change. Almost imperceptible, but enough to freeze my every movement. The surface of the structure reacted, not mechanically, but organic, as if I recognized something. Or some lines that were previously invisible began to emerge, drawing patterns, shapes, sequences, and in the middle of them, data information being displayed. Not on the screen, but directly on the surface itself. I didn't touch, I didn't come any closer, but I could see, and what I saw removed any doubts that remained. They weren't just static records. They were analyzes, projections, possibility scenarios being calculated. And in the center of it all, one more time, my image, my history, but now something new, odds, possible paths, future decisions being brought forward. It wasn't just watching me, I was studying myself, predicting, calculating every action before I even took it. And it was at that moment that everything fell into place, in a brutal way. The secret I protected for years, it was never just a risk. He was the reason, the central element of something much bigger. Something that depended on me or what I carried to function. I felt a cold go through my body. Not from common fear, but understanding. Because when you understand that you are not outside the system, but inside it as an essential piece, everything changes. I tried to take a step back instinctively, but even before completing the movement, structure reacted again. Lines. Reorganized, fastest, more intense, as if they responded directly to my intention, and then new information emerged. Clara, unquestionable, a sequence of events. That hadn't happened yet, but they were being treated as inevitable, and between them a specific point in one moment. Where it all ended, or did it start? Depending on the choice, I stopped, completely controlled, breathing the racing mind. Because at that point it was no longer just about surviving, but to understand the role they were forcing me to play. Looked away for a second, trying to break that connection, but it was useless, because the feeling remained, as if the system had already registered everything, every reaction, every micro-movement, every hesitation. I looked back at the structure now. With growing certainty, it wasn't giving me options. It was guiding me to a conclusion, a specific decision. In any deviation, it would be corrected one way or another. I took a deep breath, feeling that, for the first time since it all started, I was seeing the real level of what was involved. It wasn't surveillance, it was not common control, it was prediction, it was path manipulation, it was a system that didn't just react to the world, but it shaped him and I. Without realizing it had been molded together from the beginning, I watched the projections once. Again, the scenarios, possible versions of what hasn't happened yet, and one thing became clear. In all of them I got there, it didn't matter what changed before, it didn't matter the path, the fate was the same. That meant something even deeper. It wasn't about choice, it was about inevitability, but even within something inevitable, there is still a point, a single point where something can be changed, even if minimally, even at a high cost. And that's what I needed to find. Why accept the path they had? Trace it meant accepting the end that was already calculated, and I hadn't gotten that far to simply fulfill a script. I stood firm. In front of the structure now, no longer just watching, but being watched back. And for the first time, I didn't try to hide. I didn't try to disguise. I made it clear in my posture, in my presence, that I had understood, even without saying anything, even without touching anything I knew, and that also knew that I knew, and in that absolute silence, between me and something that shouldn't exist, a new tension is formed, deeper, more dangerous, because now it wasn't just the system analyzing me anymore. It was a confrontation, no words, no movement, but completely real, between what I was and what they wanted me to become. And it was in this silent confrontation that something inside me changed definitively. Until then, I still reacted, even when you think you were in control, even when I believed I was making decisions. But in that moment, faced with something that had already calculated my every step, reacting no longer makes sense. Because reacting was exactly what sustained that it was, what fed the system, every predictable answer, every escape attempt, every hesitation, everything was already part of the projections. I remained motionless, but not paralyzed. It was different. It was choice. I started to slow down my breathing, control the pace, not out of fear, but to break the pattern. Because if that analyzed behavior, so behavior was the only variable I could distort, I took a step, but not in the expected direction. Not back, not forward, a slight lateral shift, almost insignificant, but outside of any direct logic. The lines on the surface reacted faster this time, trying to recalculate, reorganize. As if that simple movement had created noise I felt, not with the eyes, but with the presence. That something there had been affected, not interrupted, but forced to adjust. And it was in this minute detail that I found the first real failure. It was not a structural flaw, it was a failure of prediction. Because predicting depends on pattern, and pattern depends on repetition. If I stopped being predictable, I stopped being completely controllable. The realization came clear, direct, no room for doubt. I didn't need to destroy the system. I needed to get out of his reach. And that didn't mean physically running away. It meant breaking the logic he used to anticipate me. I started walking again, but this time no constant rhythm, no obvious direction. Interrupted movements, unexpected breaks, subtle changes, each action disconnected from the previous one, creating an irregular flow. The projections on the surface began to fragment. Patterns are no longer linear, sequences have lost stability. And for the first time I saw something that hadn't appeared before, uncertainty, not like emotion. But as a result, the scenarios no longer converged with the same precision. Some disappeared, others appeared incomplete. As if the system is being forced to work with insufficient data that wasn't enough to set me free, but it was enough to prove that there was a loophole. I stopped again, observing the effect, memorizing every change. Because that was more valuable than any information I had seen so far. It was proof that they did not have absolute control, and where there is no absolute control, there's a possibility, even if small, even if risky. I looked up, directly addressing the structure, without deviating, no hiding, and this time, I didn't feel like I was just being analyzed. I felt like I was being confronted back, as if it recognized the change. As if I understood that something went wrong, the lines rearranged themselves again. Facis more aggressive, trying to recover the domain, trying to recalculate my behavior, but now I was no longer within the standard. I was out of line, and that completely changed the dynamic. Because systems like that are efficient when everything follows a logic, but when logic breaks, they need time, and time was exactly what I needed. I took a deep breath, keeping control without accelerating, without showing urgency, because any rush would put me back in the predictable cycle. I needed to keep breaking the rhythm, creating noise, confusing reading, and at the same time, observing, always watching, because each reaction of the system revealed something. Every adjustment, each correction attempt, showed limits, showed range, showed how far he could go, and even where I couldn't. I took one more step, this time firmer. But again, no clear direction, and I felt almost imperceptibly a change in the environment, not in the structure, but around, as if something beyond her had been activated, as if that unexpected behavior had crossed a limit. I didn't look around right away, but I realized the air has changed, the density, the feeling of space. Something was different, And that confirmed one more thing. The system did not operate alone. There were layers, external responses, protocols beyond that room. I remained in control, without stopping what you were doing, but now with divided attention between the structure and the environment. Because at that point, I was no longer just dealing with a machine, I was dealing with everything I responded to her. And that increased the risk. But it also expanded the opportunity, because the more layers, more points of failure, I kept the irregular pattern, no repeating. Movements without creating sequence. And I watched projections remained unstable, incomplete. And for the first time, no scenario led to exactly the same ending. That was new, that was not foreseen, and it was at that moment that understanding has been consolidated. Opet was no longer fully defined. I had managed to change something, even if minimal, even if temporary, but enough to break the absolute inevitability. And that meant that the end they had calculated, it was no longer guaranteed. I remained there between control and chaos, feeling that for the first time. From the beginning, the game was no longer one-sided, and even without knowing exactly what would come next, a certainty formed with precision. I was no longer just part of the system, I had become a problem within him, and it was exactly at the moment this perception was established that the environment responded in a more direct way, not like before, not just with calculations and projections, but with action. The room, that until then seemed static, began to adjust. The lines on the walls moved almost imperceptibly, but enough to change the feeling of space, as if that place was rearranging itself around me. Not to attack me, but to contain myself. I remained still for a second, absorbing change, without reacting impulsively. Because at that point, any knee-jerk reaction would put me back into the pattern, and I already knew the cost of it, the continuous sound of the structure has changed slightly. The pulse became faster, more intense, like I'm operating on a new level, processing more, calculating more, trying to regain lost control. I watched the projections again, and the difference was clear. Before there were multiple scenarios unstable, now they were being forced, reduced. As if the system was trying to limit the possibilities, bring everything back to a predictable path. There was an attempt to correct a way to eliminate the error. And at that moment, I understood something even more important. I hadn't just become a problem, I had become an anomaly in systems. Don't tolerate anomalies for long. They isolate correction or eliminate. I needed to act before any of these options were completed. But acting still required precision. I couldn't go back to logical behavior, nor fall into complete chaos. Because absolute chaos also creates patterns. I needed to maintain balance. Between the unpredictable and the intentional, I started moving again. But now with more awareness, every step calculated not by fate, but by the effect. I didn't want to get anywhere specific. I wanted to make an impact. Generating consistency. I lightly touched one of the side surfaces for the first time, and the response was immediate. The lines reacted, expanding as if that contact had been registered on multiple levels. Not just physical, but informational. I withdrew my hand at once, without repeating the gesture, without insisting, because repeating creates a pattern, and pattern creates reading, but that brief contact had already been enough. I saw new data appear in the central structure. Faster, more fragmented, as if the system was trying to understand something that didn't fit, and then something happened that hadn't happened. Before a small visual flaw, minimal projection delay, almost imperceptible but real. That was overload. Not total, but localized. And that meant the system had real-time processing limits. I kept calm, even with the tension growing, because that was the first concrete evidence of a technical limit, not just behavioral. And technical limits can be explored. I started alternating stimuli, short movements, breaks, brief contact, displacement, no sequence, no repetition, creating an irregular information flow, forcing the system to constantly recalculate, and the effect began to amplify. Projections were no longer able to stabilize. Data appeared and disappeared, some incomplete, other contradictions, and the pulse of the structure increased even more. Like I'm getting close to a tipping point, but along with that, another change came, more dangerous. The surrounding environment became even denser, closer, as if being prepared for total isolation. Maybe containment, maybe something worse. I stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of that answer, because that meant I was getting too close, but back off at that point would be to lose everything I needed to go to the limit, without passing the point of no return. And that line was invisible. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I knew it existed. I started moving again, but now with even more control, reducing the intensity, maintaining instability without forcing to the extreme, like someone balancing something about to break. And then in the middle of that unstable state, I saw something new emerge in the structure. It wasn't an ordinary projection. It wasn't a scenario. It was an access, a specific point, different from others, deeper, less visible. as if it were hidden within the system itself. And for a brief moment he was exposed. No complete protection, no filtering that was not to be seen. Not in that state, not like that. I got a little closer, without touching, without interacting directly, but recording everything, memorizing every detail, because I knew this was more than information. It was an entrance, a possibility, maybe the only real one so far to go beyond what they had allowed, but also the most risky. Why access something that the system hides? It's crossing a level that doesn't accept mistakes. I remained there, with your mind completely focused, recording every detail from that point, while the environment continued to react, trying to stabilize, trying to regain control. And in that unstable balance, between what the system wanted and what I was forcing to happen, a certainty was consolidated. I had found something that was not part of the planned path. And that, more than anything else, it was the kind of discovery that completely changes who comes out alive, and who can never leave that place again. And it was at that point, exposed for a fraction of time, that everything inside me aligned in a way that had never happened before. It was no longer instinct. It wasn't just survival. It was understanding, because what the system tried to hide was exactly what it couldn't completely control. And that changed the hierarchy of everything. I remained still, without touching, without getting closer than necessary, because I had already learned excess destroys the advantage. And at that moment, my biggest advantage was not being completely read. I noticed the point again, even though he's already starting to close in the layers coming back. The lines trying to cover what had been revealed, but it was too late. I had seen enough, not just with your eyes, but with the mind. With the standard, with the logic behind this, wasn't just physical access, it was a detour, a route off the main sequence, something that existed as redundancy, or as internal security, maybe even as a form of correction in case of failure. And that's when the realization became even clearer. If there was a route outside the main flow, so the system was never completely closed, he always anticipated the possibility of something going wrong. But I didn't anticipate that someone like me would consciously encounter this. I took a deep breath, maintaining absolute control of the body, because any acceleration now could betray intent. And intention was exactly what they tried to predict. I needed to act without apparent intention, no pattern, no visible goal. I took a sidestep, then another small. Displacements. As before, maintaining instability as I slowly positioned myself towards that point, without looking directly, without paying attention, just allowing the movement to take me as if it were random. But it wasn't. Every inch was calculated, based on what I had observed in reaction time, and the way the system tried to reorganize itself. I got close enough, feeling the change in the air again, more intense there. As if that point had a different density, a different presence, and this confirmed that it wasn't just a secondary function, it was something deeper, most essential. I stopped just before the limit without overtaking, without touching, waiting, observing, because now it wasn't about strength, it was about synchronization. I needed the right time, the exact range, where the system has not yet closed completely, but also not on high alert. That moment existed, I had already seen. Even if for a short time I kept the irregular pattern. Short movements, breaks, controlled breathing, no repetition, the system to keep recalculating. Unable to completely stabilize, and then he appeared again for less time. More unstable, but visible. The point partially open, layers failed to overlap accurately, and that was the moment I didn't hesitate, but I didn't speed up either. I just completed. The movement, natural, continuous, as if I've always been part of the flow. My hand crossed the threshold. No immediate resistance, no sudden response, but I felt a clear difference, as if I had passed through an invisible layer, something that separated two completely different levels. And in that moment, everything around reacted, not with sound, not with sudden movement, but with intensity. The structure's pulse-shot projections have completely disappeared, as if the system has entered a critical state, and the surrounding environment became heavy, almost suffocating. But I didn't back down, because I knew if I stopped at that point, everything would be reversed, and I would lose the only real advantage I had gained. I advanced further now, fully within that area, and the effect was immediate, a dump of information, not visual, but sensory, as if data is being transferred directly. No interface, no filter. I saw fragments, not with the eyes, but with the mind. Old records, decisions, events that should never be accessed. And in the middle of it all, the truth, not complete, but enough. The secret I carried for years. It wasn't something I hid, it was something that had been put into me from the beginning. I wasn't just someone who discovered I was chosen, prepared, molded to get exactly there and access exactly that. I felt the impact of this understanding stronger than anything else yet, because that took away the last illusion of control. I still had nothing had been chance, nothing had been a mistake. It was all part of a process, and that was his endpoint, or the breaking point depending on what I did from. There the flow of information continued, but it started to slow down as if the system is trying to take back control. Access stopped the connection. I needed to act fast, but not impulsive, because any error at that level there would be no correction. I kept my mind steady, absorbing as much as possible without trying to understand everything at once, just registering, because knowing too much at that moment could stop me, and I couldn't stop. Not there, not now. And in the middle of that final flow, one last piece of information stood out. Clara direct, no distortion, like it was meant for me. Not as given, but as a message. The system was not just a tool, he was a bigger build. There was something above him, something that was not being calculated, something that couldn't be predicted completely, and that it was the real center of everything I felt. The access starting to close, the connection being severe, the environment trying to return to its previous state, but I was no longer the same person who had entered. Because now I didn't just carry a secret, I carried his origin, and that completely transformed who I was within. That system, no longer a variable, no longer an anomaly, but something they should never have let reach that level, something that now they could no longer just erase. No irreversible consequences. And it was exactly this awareness that took hold in me as the access closed. There was no longer any doubt. I wasn't just someone who had gone too far, I was now something that the system itself could not accurately recalculate. The connection was interrupted completely. The flow of information has ceased, and the surrounding environment began to return to its previous state, but not completely, because something had changed irreversibly. I felt in space itself, in the way the air seemed to react to my presence, like I'm no longer just detected, but recognized on another level. Remained still for a few seconds, not out of hesitation, but because at that moment, any movement needed to start from a new logic. The logic of someone who now understood the game from the inside, and more than that, I understood that the game was not the highest level. Because what I accessed, what was above the system, it didn't operate the same way. Didn't follow the same standards, and maybe, nor could it be contained in the same way. I took a deep breath, feeling the stability of the environment rebuilding itself. The lines on the walls returning to their original state, the central structure, reducing the pulse, like you're recovering from something that shouldn't have happened, but I knew they knew that it happened and it couldn't be undone. I took the first step this time without the need to break the pattern, because it no longer made sense to act as before. The system was still there, still functional, but I wasn't in it the same way anymore. I started walking towards the exit, no rush, without trying to hide, because hiding implied fear. And at that point, fear was no longer useful. I passed again through the space where the projections appeared. Now clean, no visible data, no answers. But that didn't mean absence. It meant containment. They were holding, reorganizing, maybe deciding, and this decision would no longer be simple because I was no longer disposable, not without cost. I walked down the hall feeling the controlled silence again, but now with another perception, I could identify small variations, micro changes in the environment, as if the system was still trying to read me, rate me again, but without complete success. I got to the door, the same one where I came in, and for a brief moment I stopped, not without a doubt, but by understanding. Because when you walk through that door again, I wouldn't be leaving, I would be taking something with me. Something that shouldn't come out of there, but now he could no longer be separated from. I touched the surface, and this time, she reacted differently, faster, more direct, as if recognizing the change, and the door opened. No resistance, no delay. I crossed, returning to the other side. For the common environment, for normal flow, nothing there looked the same. People kept moving. The standard still existed, but I saw everything differently. I saw the layers, the limitations, the control points, and mainly, the points where it didn't reach completely. I kept walking, without attracting attention, without changing the external rhythm. But inside everything was aligned, of course. I no longer needed to test small flaws, nor provoke basic responses. Cause, now I knew where the system ended, and where something bigger began, and that was what really mattered. I passed the same faces, the same observers, but something in them had changed. Not in appearance, but in the way they reacted to my presence. Less certain, more caution, as if they also noticed, even without fully understanding, that I was no longer at the same level as before. I followed to my starting point, the same space, the same table, the same objects, but completely different, because now I knew that was all just the surface, the visible layer of something much deeper. I touched the table, feeling the same texture as before, but with another reading. That almost imperceptible line was still there, but now it no longer felt like a warning, like a marker, as if indicating a starting point and not surveillance. I sat down slowly, no rush, no tension. And for the first time since it all began, there was no urgency. Because what needed to happen, it had already been activated. Not as an external event, but as an internal change. I didn't need to run away anymore. I don't even hide, don't even react, because the biggest risk was not being found. This was what would happen when they fully understood what I had become. I looked up, observing the surrounding environment, every detail, every move, everything still working. But now, within a new context. A context where I was no longer a piece being moved, but he wasn't the one in control either. I was at a different point between the two sides entered the system, and what existed beyond him. And this point was exactly where the balance ceased to exist, and something new began to form, something that could no longer be predicted, nor contained, not erased, because now, the secret I protected for years was no longer just a secret, it was a living presence inside me, and for the first time it wasn't him who was destroying me, he was the one who was turning me into something the system itself was never designed to handle.